you for joining us. This is our second episode of our Central Talks series. And today we have our sister, Dr. Kim Bonner. I can say doctor now. She's fully done with her PhD. As many of you remember, Kim was a campus student here at Princeton University. She was converted as a sophomore at Princeton. And she has just earned her PhD in epidemiology from the University of Minnesota. And so we're so grateful to have her. She's going to begin working for the CDC in just a week. And so we're grateful that she would take the time to give us some insights into all that's going on in the world right now, especially with this virus. So Kim, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. Really grateful that you would do this.
Thank you so much for having me, Johnny. It's great to be here.
Amen. Amen. Well, you know, as a church leader, you know, there's a lot of things that we have to take into account with meeting and meeting together specifically. And, you know, we have this battle of, you know, we can't give way to fear and paranoia. And yet we have to be responsible. We have to love one another enough to care about, you know, what we're doing and what decisions we're making, that we're really protecting one another, especially those that are most vulnerable to the virus among us. And so this is really great to be able to do this and just get some helpful information that we could pass along to the disciples here. And so I'm going to jump into some questions, and then, you know, we could fill in if there's any other thoughts you'd like to add along the way. But I want to start off, you know, let's start off with just the basics. You know, can you give us a brief description of just how the virus spreads, just as a refresher so that we're all aware, okay, this is how the virus actually spreads?
Sure. So this is a virus that is spread mostly through respiratory droplets. We know this virus is quite new. We've only known about it for the last 7 months. So there is a lot that we're learning. But what we're seeing is that as somebody is exhaling or talking or laughing or singing, then those droplets go in the air. And if they land in someone's nose or mouth, they can get to the lungs and infect that person. We think that that's the major route of infection. There may be some infection based on touching common surfaces, and that's why people are encouraged to always be washing their hands and not touching their face. But we think the major route of infection is from person to person through the air.
Got it. Okay. Well, that certainly makes sense, and something that, you know, we could always keep in mind. I know a lot of us, you know, wipe down food and stuff like that as an extra precaution, which is wise. But as you said, the main way is through these droplets. I appreciate that. Now, in New Jersey, they've lifted some of the restrictions. One of the restrictions they lifted was that now they're allowing groups of up to 25 to meet indoors. So, okay, now that restriction is lifted, what concerns would you have about, you know, groups? Obviously, this would affect us even as a church. What would concern you about even meeting indoors at this point, and some things to keep in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to answer that, I'll tell you about 2 churches that had an experience with this earlier in the year. One was in Washington. It was a choir practice, about 2.5 hours, 60 people. One person had mild symptoms at the start of that practice. Following that in-person practice where people were singing together, there were 32 cases of coronavirus. From that, there was 20 secondary cases. So those 32 people infected another 20. 3 people were hospitalized, 1 person died. And so that's from one session. There's another case of a church in Arkansas where the pastor and the women's ministry leader had been serving in that church. The day they got symptoms, they canceled all church services indefinitely. But because they had had a church service 5 days before, and they had had Bible studies and had been meeting with people, in the end, out of a church of 92, there were 35 cases. There were 3 deaths, And then there were 26 more cases in the community and an additional death linked to that. And so what we see, the challenge of churches, is that we are connected. We do sing together. We do hug one another. And so to really change those practices, we may have a hard time in actuality. And what we don't want to do is amplify the spread of disease. So that's the concern. We really want to protect each other, and we want to protect our communities.
Okay, great. That's very helpful to hear, because obviously we all want to meet together, right? We all want to see each other, but we've got to be aware of some of the challenges that come with that. Now, in terms of outdoors, one of the questions that often comes up, okay, so outdoors, it seems to be safer. That's what we hear. But in terms of meeting outdoors, is it still obviously recommended that you social distance when you meet outdoors, and or wear a face mask, even though you're outdoors?
Yeah, absolutely, Johnny. So the lowest risk thing you can do is to continue to meet virtually. So a higher risk thing would be meeting outdoors. And even in those circumstances, you want to keep the 6 feet distance. You want to wear a mask. You want to be washing your hands as soon as you get back, and really maintain that social distance throughout. And that can be hard in a group that's outside. You're almost going to be shouting across the way to talk to somebody.
Yeah, yeah. And now, have you seen any reliable data that kind of really shows whether wearing a mask is beneficial to spreading the virus? Obviously, there's always the debates, and often they're political, but what's the data out there in terms of, are these masks actually beneficial?
Yeah, so there is some data on it. And one of the things we're finding is that even a cloth mask, so something like this, if people in the community are wearing it, if I am asymptomatic, then it reduces my spread of that virus to other people. So me wearing the mask is protecting all of the people, or many of the people around me. It's not foolproof, but it offers protection. And beyond that, what we're seeing is there are potentially even not just saving lives benefits, but economic benefits. So on Tuesday, Goldman Sachs released a report saying if everybody in the public wore masks, that we would save 5% of our GDP in the US. And so it's a way to show respect to people, it's a way to protect people, and it's also a way to recover quicker.
Wow, that's great. That's great information. Now, are there any practices, like additional practices, that you would recommend to anyone listening to further protect themselves from the virus?
I think the things that you've already been doing are the key things. I know Central's been doing a great job. So trying to stay home as much as you can, washing your hands, keeping a social distance, wearing a mask. It's those basics you want to just keep doing. I know it can feel kind of old and kind of stale at this point, but those are the practices that are going to protect you and protect those around you.
Okay, great, great. Now, we've been seeing the current infection rates around the country, and although New York and New Jersey infection rates are pretty low right now at the moment, what would you recommend for those that are traveling, outside of our tri-state area? What would you recommend to them if they're traveling outside of our area to protect themselves and protect those back here at home? What would you recommend to them as they travel?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're now seeing daily case counts of 40,000 a day. And this week, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci, said we could have up to 100,000 new cases a day. So we are in the early days of this. And as a country, we are still in the first wave. And so the first question that I would ask myself in travel is this travel necessary? do I need to go? Or can this be a season that maybe I'm staying home more, trying to find ways to connect with those people who I might be visiting differently? Because at the moment, travel is a higher risk activity. We know that for every one case that we're finding in the country, there are probably 10 more that are undetected. And 50% of people who are hospitalized for coronavirus don't even know how they were exposed. So that's really the first thing I would suggest. And then the second would to be, if you do travel, to be quite cautious. So try and limit any rest stops, try and limit going into restaurants. You may be surrounded by people who are opting not to wear masks or not to social distance, and that will increase your own risk. So try to avoid crowds and use hand sanitizer, wash your hands as much as possible, wear a mask.
Gotcha. Great. Okay. Now, can you give us kind of a general sense of what, you know, epidemiologists are thinking our goal should be with the virus at this time? Obviously, it's pretty spread out. What's the general sense? Obviously, you know, that how should we combat this? You know, this is obviously speaks to the idea. There's some who say, oh, well, let's go for herd immunity, you know, that sort of thing. What's the general sense you get in your field about that? What the goal should be?
That's a great question. And there is a lot of debate on which routes make the most sense. And as we start looking now 6-7 months into this epidemic, we're seeing how different choices are playing out around the world. I think for us as individuals who are currently living in the US, and for those everywhere, the same core practices are the things that we can do to protect ourselves and to protect others. So it's hand washing, it's wearing a mask, it's social distancing. I think when we talk about some of those broader debates, something like herd immunity, which herd immunity would mean, can enough of the population have antibodies, so an immune response to the virus, that the virus slows in how quickly it transmits. And there's a few, usually this is spoken about with a vaccine. So when a vaccine for coronavirus is available, then if enough people are vaccinated, then the virus itself can't spread as easily. So some people are now saying, well, why don't we have enough people get sick? And then this whole thing can blow over. And there are a few issues with that approach. One of the main issues is we don't know how long any sort of immunity would last. So if someone gets sick today, we don't know how long they're protected from coronavirus. The second thing is, it's very possible that people could get extremely sick. So even those who are young and healthy and not in any risk group, we've seen cases of hospitalizations and we've seen deaths. And so this is not a low risk proposition to just get coronavirus. The third issue, and I think this is really kind of the crux of it, and especially as disciples, is that millions of people will die unnecessarily. So if we take routes where we're trying to protect everyone and trying to protect the most vulnerable, then more people are going to live through this pandemic. If we choose to look the other way, then people who are among the most marginalized in our society are going to suffer the most. And so I think one of the most loving things we can do is to really try and stay the course and really each person do what they can to limit the spread of disease.
Wow, thank you for that. That's very thoughtful and very helpful in understanding this stuff, because obviously, you know, you hear the different debates and it's tough to kind of think through all this as we're going. So that is really super helpful. I guess, as a disciple, there are things that we love to do. And you mentioned a few of them already in regards to meeting together and that kind of stuff. But, we love physical contact, the hugs, everything. And, what are some specific things, obviously we've got the sanitary stuff in terms of washing our hands and even wearing a mask and that kind of stuff. But if you think about disciples and just how we interact with one another, that are specific to us, what are some things that you would recommend that we, really rethink or possibly alter in terms of how we can interact with one another so that we can help protect one another? For example, one of the examples is singing together, right? Like that, if you're singing together indoors, that's actually, very risky. And so are there any other things or things that you would say in terms of just helping to protect one another as disciples?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There's a few, actually, there are many things that we can do as disciples to really show love to one another and our community during this time. I think this is a moment where our fellowship can really shine.
Mm.
And I think first among that is recognizing that this is a long haul. So we're not in a sprint. We do have quite a bit of this pandemic ahead of us. And so as disciples, we need to think about what are some long-term creative ways that we can stay connected with one another. So whether that is making sure that there are regular prayer times on the calendar, discipling times, really making sure that that can be done digitally and safely. I think that that is kind of a critical aspect of our habit that needs to be there. I think secondly, we have many people around us who are feeling very isolated, whether disciples or not. And so once we have a sense of the practices that are going to keep us healthy and strong, it's really a time to take initiative, to reach out, to be thinking about those other people, and to be doing it in a non-contact manner, to be calling, doing Zoom calls. Maybe if you're walking together one-on-one, both with masks and from a distance, that's possible, but we have to think about how hard it is when you're physically near somebody. Are you really gonna not hug that person? So think about that in advance. I think given how challenging the economic situation is for people, this is a time that disciples can really practice benevolence, whether within the church or with those who we know who are hurting. This is a time to be as charitable as possible. And I think in terms of other options, this is a time where people are going to be making very different decisions. And so we want to respect each other's boundaries. If there is a disciple who is not going to see anybody until after everyone is vaccinated, we want to respect that choice and support people spiritually. And if there are other people who are taking potentially more other approaches, we also want to respect each person's practices, but protect ourselves, protect one another. And I think finally, one thing from a health systems perspective is if everybody gets a flu shot this year, we're going to reduce the number of cases of flu, and that's going to take some of the strain off of our healthcare system. This is not a winter where you want to be uncertain of, do I have flu or do I have coronavirus? So those are some of the things I would consider, but really, however we can meet one another in a contactless way, that is the safest way that we can do Bible studies, that we can connect and encourage just as much as possible.
Mm. No, that's so great. It's funny. We've had people drive by our home and park in front of the house and even just wave and talk to each other from 6 feet. And we can't just underestimate just how encouraging that is. And it was just great to see, other than in the screen, right? But just
Yeah.
see a live human being that you love, that you miss. And it is, we could do a lot just with that, honestly, if we just even did that. And so I'm so with you. That's so encouraging. And also, I really appreciate your admonition about really seeking to still meet needs, among us, even neighbors. There's just so many ways that we could really make a difference, even, not having the direct contact, but, just keeping 6 feet and having a conversation and visiting someone and, bringing someone some groceries. There's so many ways. So I think that's really super helpful. Um, I'll ask you one more question, and obviously, we're hearing about vaccine, maybe yes, maybe not so soon. Obviously, I know the information changes, right, from time to time, because it depends on the data that they get back from each phase, right, and so each phase of the trials, and so. So Dr. Fauci just said a couple days ago that maybe, and he says obviously it could go in different directions when you're doing these trials. Possibly we get something early 2021. But he actually said something that was interesting that I had not really thought of, and I wondered, what your thoughts were on it. He said, he'd be happy if the vaccine, if we get a vaccine, first of all, right? And then secondly, if we get a vaccine, that it's 75% effective. And I guess that kind of, I'll take 75%, right? But I did wonder, and he even brought up the point, would we still even get herd immunity if you get a portion of the population that doesn't like to take vaccines to begin with, and then on top of it, the ones that do are only 75%. So anyway, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, any additional information in regards to that.
Yeah, he raises a really important point, and that is that vaccines have a range of how well they work. And so depending on which vaccine candidates end up making it to the final stage of clinical trials, we'll get to see how effective are they. Right now, they're being tested in safety trials. And so some vaccines are very effective, 95% effective. But other vaccines are somewhat effective. And so what that means is if you have a vaccine that's 50% effective, then I have half the chance of getting coronavirus. So I would absolutely still reduce my chances of getting the vaccine by 50%.
Yeah.
But what that means is, in order for the pandemic to slow down and to really go away, we would need a lot of people to choose to take it. And so that is going to be, that's going to be something that each of us can be thinking about as these months go on, and as we're looking to resume our normal lives. If we're all choosing to get a vaccine, then we're able to slow down this infection person to person. And so that really is another way that we can show social solidarity and care for one another, because it doesn't just protect me, it protects those around me.
Wow, that's great stuff. Well, Kim, I just want to thank you for taking this time with us. And I also want to say thank you. I think I've mentioned this to the church here. You've been a key person that we've, as a leadership here, have gotten input from, just to understand some of these things, and played a key part in some of the decisions we did early on that, quite frankly, I'm not sure we would have made those decisions had it not been for your input. So I really appreciate it, and super grateful for you. We'll be praying for your work in the CDC. I'm praying that God just uses you in a great way to be a light around everyone that you work with. And also, hopefully, we get past this virus in some way, and we can just continue to glorify God. So thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate it. And we'll definitely be praying for you and your endeavors in the CDC in a week, right? You started 1 week?
I start in 1 week. Yep. Thanks so much, Johnny. And I miss everybody at Central. Please come out to Portland. You're most welcome.
Amen. Amen. Well, once we could travel, maybe we'll think about
Yeah. After you've got a vaccine, after you can travel, not right now.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you so much, Kim. Appreciate it. And we'll stay in touch.
All right. Take care, Johnny. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.